Good morning everyone, today we're going to be comparing the Tenebrous weapon with the Kouklophis weapons because I know a lot of people are confused on which weapon to invest in, especially if you just want to use one weapon and you don't want to make multiple copies of weapons because augments are fairly expensive. But before we jump into all of that, if you're new to the channel, I upload NGS content daily, so if you do play this game, I would really appreciate a subscribe as it really helps out the channel. Anyway, without further ado, let's begin the video. So before we jump into the Google spreadsheets and all the numbers and the nitty-grittiness, I want to give you guys more of a general overview or a TLDR. So the number one question you should be asking yourself before you invest into any weapon series at all is what activities do you actually do in game? Because there's many activities to farm for Meseta in NGS, whether you're doing the recon units, whether you're doing veteran hunting, whether you're doing purple triggers, it really depends on what type of content do you do the most will determine what type of weapon series you should use. So as you can see here, I'm currently using the Tenebrous bow, but it has a fixed attack level 4 and I multi-weaponed it with a katana. That way I'm still able to use a katana, benefit from the fixed attack 4, and also benefit from its amazing weapon potential, which gives me this 15% extra critical hit rate. However, the content that I mainly farm is exploration zones as well as combat zones, which means that a lot of the enemies that I fight, or basically all the enemies that I fight, are actually seasonal enemies, which is why this weapon is so powerful, because it has this passive over here, which against seasonal enemies, I get potency plus 5%, I gain a 20% critical hit rate, and I also have damage resistance plus 25%. However, this only works against seasonal enemies. So for example, if I were to go into a purple trigger, this augment over here would be absolutely useless because the mobs in Stia Devastators or any of the Devastators are not seasonal enemies, they are just regular enemies, which means I do not gain any of these buffs. So now that we have a general understanding of, okay, whether they're seasonal mobs or not seasonal mobs, what type of content you're farming for and all of that stuff, the big question is going to be, okay, what about my Kouklophis weapon? And many of you guys may be looking at me and going like, Carol, where is your Kouklophis weapon? Why don't you have one yet? And the reason for that is because I haven't farmed enough Infernium to get my fixed attack level 3 Kouklophis weapon, because you need 200 Infernium. Now, this is not exactly the best, most efficient way to get Infernium. Like normally, if you were smart, you would probably pick up one without a fixa or a fixed attack 1, and then slowly build that up, and then use the fixa transfer system to transfer the fixed attack 3 onto your final Kouklophis weapon. That way you can just stick with one weapon and you don't need to diversify like what I've done and invest into multiple weapons. As you can see here, I've got an effulgent katana, I've got a Tenebrous bow over here, and I've kind of scattered my resources all over the place because all of these different weapons need to be re-augmented. So I did have to use quite a few capsules, unfortunately. And so if you're the type of person that doesn't play that much and you don't have a lot of capsules, then maybe you should just stick with one weapon and one weapon only instead of investing across multiple weapons. All right, with all of that being said and done, it is time to jump into the nitty-gritty, into all of the numbers. So over here's an overview on what my gear is and what stats I'm currently using. However, I do highly recommend that you actually input your own augments over here, because depending on your potency, your floor potency, as well as all the different augments and armors that you're using, will change the outcome on what weapon might be best for you. However, I want to stress again, at the end of the day, it really depends on what type of content you are doing. If you're just doing combat zones and you're just doing exploration zones, then the seasonal weapon is going to be fine, because all of the enemies you're going to be fighting are going to be seasonal enemies, and the majority of them are going to be weak to the ice element, which pretty much gives the seasonal weapon a huge upper hand in the damage department. As you can see right here, you know, all of these crazy percentages, 20% damage increase, 22% damage increase. If we go over here, 25% damage increase. You know, these are very big numbers. However, I don't want to jump ahead of myself, and let's just take this one step at a time. The biggest question that everyone has been asking me is, Caro, I have a Kouklophis attack level 3 weapon. I finally farmed it, I got my 200 Infernium, I finally made this weapon. But there's this seasonal weapon right now, and everyone tells me that this seasonal weapon is better, that it's overpowered, that it's busted, and that I should be using the seasonal weapon. Should I give up my fixed attack level 3 Kouklophis weapon in order to use the seasonal weapon, or should I just stick with my Kouklophis weapon because I've invested so much into it? And the short answer is you can stick with your Kouklophis weapon. It's perfectly fine. You do not need to remake another seasonal weapon, or you can even just use a budget version of the seasonal weapon if you are planning to farm in exploration zones as well as in combat zones. Now, the reason I say this is simply because when we look at the damage breakdown, you can see over here, this is a fixed attack level 3. This is our baseline, all right? The main numbers that we want to look at are going to be the green numbers over here, because the green ones mean there's a DPS increase. However, what I want to bring to your attention over here is these are fixed attack, fixed fatale, and fixed termina. So if we were to look over here, the Tenebrous weapon against seasonal enemies, which are also weak to the ice element, no matter what you do, it's going to be a damage increase. The reason for this is simply because of this single augment alone, where you're getting a whopping 20% critical hit rate, 5% potency, as well as 25% damage resistance. So it's mainly the 20% critical hit rate, which is increasing your damage so much because you're just going to be critting a lot more often, and you're going to be hitting those massive numbers a lot more often. And that is why even a seasonal weapon with no fixa over here is going to be a 10% damage increase over your fixa attack 3 Kouklophis weapon against a dolls enemy. So remember, the Kouklophis weapon does get a DPS increase against dolls specifically, so we are using that as the baseline and not against an enemy that is not a dolls, okay? So just keep that in mind, that if you're fighting against a non-doll enemy, that this DPS increase is going to be even bigger. However, this percentage drops drastically if you are just fighting a regular seasonal enemy that is not weak to ice. Now, many of you guys may have noticed, but there are a lot of seasonal enemies that are not weak to the ice element, especially if you're not farming in the Stia region. Let's say that you want to go back to Retem Al Noth because you want to farm seasonal points. You're going to notice that a lot of the mobs in Retem Al Noth are not weak to ice, they're still weak to lightning, however they are seasonal enemies. You can see that your damage drop off is significant. You go from 10% down to 1.26% DPS increase simply because you are not gaining the 15% damage of the elemental weakness. And if you look over here, this is the actual number. Your damage drop off is going to be from 680 damage per hit down to an average of 625 damage per hit. So, you know, looking at the numbers itself versus the percentage itself, the percentage look really big. But when you look at the damage numbers itself, it's like, oh, it's like a 50 damage decrease. It's not that big. So just understand that even though some of these percentages may look freaking massive, that in reality, when you're comparing them to the actual numbers, to the actual damage numbers, it's not that big of a deal. So with this newfound knowledge, now you know if you are farming enemies that are seasonal enemies and mainly in the Stia region, then yes, the seasonal weapon is going to be your best friend. A very good example is, let's say you're fighting the recon units or you're fighting gigantics in the Stia region, then yes, you want to use the seasonal weapon because all of those enemies, first of all, they're in the exploration zone, second of all, they are seasonal enemies, and third of all, they are all weak to the ice element, which means you're going to gain all of these benefits. So you might want to look out for a seasonal weapon with a high fixed attack, fatale, or termina in order to gain all of these bigger percentages. Like let's say you get a fixed termina 5, you know, that's a 20% damage increase. And if we scroll down here and we look at the actual number, you'll be hitting an average of 745 damage versus if you didn't have the fixa, it would only be 680. Now this damage number looks a lot more significant, but keep in mind it is going to be a fixed termina level 5 because remember, with all that extra crit rate that we have, you're gaining like an extra 35% crit rate, so you can afford to pump up that crit damage in order to crit a lot more. However, if you want to go the fixa fatale route because, you know, maybe you want 40% crit rate, 50% crit rate, whatever, you can always go the fixa fatale 5 route and you'll still gain a significant amount of DPS. You know, you're still going to be hitting on average 729 damage, which is very powerful. But let's say you are like Chrono Catastrophe and you live for purple triggers. That is the content that you love about NGS. Well, if that's the content that you like to do all the time, then the seasonal weapon might not be as great, because we're going to look over here. It's going to be the seasonal weapon with max potency against an enemy that is weak to ice. So this is going to be Stia Devastators against the Gigantics, because remember, Stia Devastators, the Gigantics there, are not seasonal enemies, but they are weak to the ice element. So you do benefit from the extra 15% potency because they're weak to that element. However, you do not gain the seasonal event buff of that extra 20% critical hit rate, which is why your damage numbers over here are going to suffer significantly. You can see that you don't actually get a DPS increase until you start hitting Fixa Attack level 3, Fatale level 3, or Termina level 2. And even then, the DPS increase is very, very minor compared to your Kouklophis Fixa Attack level 3. So if purple triggers is something that you're going to be doing all the time, and you already have invested a Kouklophis Fixa Attack level 3 weapon, it's already done, then just stick with your Kouklophis weapon. There's no real need to invest into another event weapon unless you have very, very low floor potency. The reason I say this is because with my build over here, I have extremely high floor potency of 61.52%, and I have an overall potency of 103%. And this is because I have Mastery 4, I have Addy Death Mel Raw, I have Dussel 4, Might 4, Gigas Might 4. Now, of course, I could inflate my floor potency even further by using the Dreadkeeper 4, as well as using Alt Secreta 4, however, I chose not to do so. But if you have extremely low floor potency and extremely high regular potency, then you might want to actually look into the event weapon, because remember, you want to hit those big critical hits, because critical hits ignore floor potency and there won't be any variance there, because your crits are always going to hit the maximum amount of damage, which is really awesome. So if you are in the camp of I don't care about floor potency at all, I only care about raw potency, then yes, the seasonal weapon is going to be very powerful and you should look into it. However, keep in mind that you are going to be looking at Fixa Fatale or Fixa Termina. I personally prefer Fixa Fatale, like at least a Fixa Fatale 4 or above, because that's going to give you a huge DPS increase. As you can see over here, that is a 3.59% DPS increase. And if you can get a Fixa Fatale level 5, it's going to give you a 4.18% damage increase, which is really, really big. And the reason for this is because you're just going to be critting a lot more often, which means you can maintain maximum DPS uptime more often. So in conclusion, your weapon choice should reflect what type of content you enjoy farming for in NGS. If you're going to be doing exploration zones as well as combat zones, the seasonal weapon is a no-brainer. Use it. You gain that 20% extra critical hit rate. It's going to carry you super, super hard. You're going to be dealing tons of damage, and you can actually skimp out on a lot of your augments and just go pure potency and ignoring floor potency because you don't need it, because you have massive amounts of crit rate. Now, if you have a Fixa Attack 3 Kouklophis weapon already and you don't want to invest into another weapon because you want to save money for fashion, or you don't have any more capsules, or for whatever reason you just don't want to make another weapon because it's such a pain in the butt, it's perfectly fine to just stick with your Kouklophis weapon. It's a very good weapon. You're gonna be fine. However, if you ever do decide to farm for Recon Gigantics or farm dread enemies or even go to combat zones, then I highly recommend picking up the event weapon just from the event merchant herself, the one that's fully augmented already, and just use that weapon, you know, shove in like a stat 4 or something, and you're good to go. Even though that event weapon won't be min-max augmented, it's still going to perform better than your Kouklophis weapon in those specific scenarios where you're farming Recon Gigantics, dread enemies, as well as combat zones, because of that seasonal event buff. It's just too strong to pass up on. Just use that weapon. Even if it is not min-maxed, it's gonna perform better than your min-max Kouklophis weapon. However, if you really care about min-maxing it and you really want to see those huge numbers, then yes, you can go another event weapon, but replace this augment over here that'll give you even more raw potency, because again, the Gigantics that you're fighting in Stia Devastators or in the purple triggers are not going to be seasonal enemies, so this augment over here is going to be absolutely useless, which is why you should replace it with something else. So if you are truly a min-maxer, you're going to have multiple weapons. You're going to have a seasonal weapon for regular mobs that are all seasonal mobs. You're going to have a seasonal weapon specifically for the Stia Devastators. And then of course, you're going to have an effulgent weapon for the urgent quest in the Stia region. So that would be the ideal scenario. However, that is a lot of weapons that you need to augment, so most people aren't going to do that. The average player, I would just say, stick with one weapon, stick with your Kouklophis weapon. If you're going to invest into that weapon. All of your other weapons, just use it as kind of fodder, you know, just kind of put placeholder, put budget augments on it, and just call it a day and you're gonna be fine.
Special thanks to all the members for supporting the channel. It really means a lot to me. Thank you again.
But yeah, that's all I wanted to cover in today's video. Hopefully you guys found it helpful. If you did, I would appreciate a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you guys in tomorrow's video. Bye!
What can I say except you're welcome for the heals, the boosts, the rest.